I'll be speaking to Tony Greenstein, a British activist and blogger, about his book, Zionism During the Holocaust, the weaponization of memory to serve nation and state. I think it's a fine book, and he has a massive number of links and footnotes. He goes right to the facts and the details. One thing I like about it is what I would call the positives, the people and groups who during the Holocaust did work to save Jews, and I hope we can get into that at some point. He'll be speaking to us from Brighton on the west shore of Great Britain. Good afternoon, Tony.
Good afternoon. It's the southern shore, actually.
Okay.
It's on the south.
Thanks for the geography lesson. So let me start in perhaps an unusual way. I'm a retired school teacher. I want you to give an overall grade for the conduct of Zionist leaders during the Holocaust. On a scale of A to F, how would you grade their efforts to lead and protect Jews during that time?
Oh, well, A. I mean, it is the lowest, without a doubt.
Well, over here, F is the lowest.
Is it? Oh, right. Sorry, I wasn't sure which. Well, in that case, F. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Definitely a fail. Throughout the Holocaust, they prioritized building a Jewish state to actually saving living, existing Jews. So of that, there is really no doubt. I don't think even they can claim otherwise.
So let's get into the details. Your book concentrates on the Holocaust period, but we do have to go back at least into the 1930s with the takeover of Germany by Hitler. Did the Zionists lead the fight against Hitler?
At no stage did they lead any fight against Hitler. As Donald Newak points out, there were occasions when they stood shoulder to shoulder with him and heckling the bourgeois leaders of the German Jewish community for their admittedly feeble attempts to combat anti-Semitism. So no, I mean, Zionism accepted that the Nazis were essentially correct. When the Nazis said Jews were aliens and not part of the German nation, the Zionists said yes. And of course, the Nazis used what the Zionists were saying for their own purposes. So absolutely not. In any case, let's be clear about it. The Zionists represented what, 2% of the German Jewish community? They were a fringe movement. They were unimportant. And of course, you know, I mean, every group and every people in their struggle has collaborators, and the Zionists were our collaborators. That's what all one can say, really.
You can see some things in their writings where they saw Hitler's rise as a, quote, opportunity, unquote.
Well, yes. I mean, Ben-Gurion was rubbing his hands with glee at the golden opportunity the rise of the Nazis produced. Noah Lucas, I quote, at the beginning of one of the chapters, who says exactly that amidst the chaos and carnage of Hitler's Europe, Ben-Gurion saw only opportunity, because it was only in those circumstances that Zionism could triumph. If Jewish communities were left unmolested to develop and grow naturally, Zionism, with its strange ideas that all Jews should go to Palestine and congregate there, didn't appeal to them. And you can actually see that in a book which I'm rereading at the moment by Anne Frank, her own diary, when she considers Zionists to be quite strange creatures. I mean, she was only a 15-year-old girl, but to her, she wanted to live in the free Holland, Netherlands after the war. She didn't have any ideas of emigrating to Palestine and separating herself off. She wanted to be part of a rich European culture. And that was true of most Jews, of course. And the Zionists derided them for that, because they had no national consciousness in their view.
And then these Zionists, who in Germany represented, as you say, only 2% of the population, go and make this deal, the agreement to transfer wealth and people, mainly wealth probably, to their project in Palestine, the transfer agreement.
Well,
go
that's
over
right.
the
I mean,
head- I'm sorry, go ahead.
today it's portrayed as a life-saving measure, that the primary purpose was to save German Jews. I mean, that is just an outright lie. For a start, it only saved 20,000, and they were the richest, the best off. I mean, not all German Jews had £1,000 in cash, which today is the equivalent of 80,000, 90,000 pounds, and whatever the equivalent in dollars would be. In addition to the amounts of money needed to purchase heavy machinery, equipment, and so on in Germany for export to Palestine. So it saved the very Jews who would have had no difficulty getting admission overseas. What it didn't do was aid the poor German Jews, the elderly, the frail, the weak, those without resources. It had no effect whatsoever. And in any case, it saved 20,000 out of the 50-odd thousand who went to Palestine. So by any stretch of the imagination, it was a failure. But why did the Nazis adopt it? Because they saw it was the means of overcoming and destroying the boycott.
Right.
So the Zionists deliberately sabotaged the instinctive reaction of Jews everywhere to boycott Nazi Germany, because it grew up spontaneously, this boycott. You know, I mean, the first thing that happened when Hitler came to power is Jews resolved not to buy German goods, and then to extend that to a campaign to get others to not to buy German goods. The Zionists at that time, before Haberer, were already vehemently opposed to it because it was un-Zionist. Zionism wants to do business. It doesn't want to oppose anti-Semitism. So they looked for an opportunity as to how they could benefit their own project. And that's not just me saying that now. That was what the pro-Zionist Jewish Chronicle was saying, and others. I mean, it was the bourgeois Jews together with the Zionists who opposed it. And we should remember that now.
So as the 30s go on and Hitler becomes more and more extreme, people recognize this is a menace. What about the famous Kindertransport to your country, where they brought children, German Jewish children to Britain? Was that a Zionist idea?
Quite the contrary. The idea was of the British Jewish bourgeoisie and the Board of Deputies, which at that time was not controlled by the Zionists. I mean, they put to the British government, which surprisingly accepted it, that 10,000 German Jewish children, but not their parents, of course, could emigrate to Britain. The Zionists threw up their hands in horror. And Ben Gurion made that famous statement, which I reprint in my book, but is why, I mean, no one denies that it's genuine. No one, because everyone knows that's exactly what he said. It's reprinted in Shabtai Tebeth's biography of him, and Tebeth is a hagiographer more than a biographer. That if given the choice between saving half Germans, Jewish children in England, and all of in Palestine rather, and all of them in England, he would prefer the former, because you've got to think of the survival of our people, not just these children. You know, and Chaim Weizmann was even more adamant. I mean, he had this row with Malcolm MacDonald, the colonial secretary, and which he basically said, I mean, we will fight you again over this. But the Zionists couldn't, because the Board of Deputies hadn't yet been captured by the Zionists. And I make the point, if they had won it 2 years earlier, then those 10,000 children would probably have died too.
So the Nazis take over Poland and other countries in the East, and they set up Judenrat. What was that? And how did the Zionist leadership oppose or support the Judenrat?
Well, the Judenrat were established in most Polish ghettos. And they were an instrument of the Nazis. and they were composed largely of the existing Jewish leadership. What can you say about them? I mean, the Zionists today make all sorts of apologies. They had no choice, they were compelled, and so on and so forth. But I go into these debates in some detail and basically say that even though they did fulfill certain welfare functions, soup kitchens, and so on, even their best works were still part of the Nazi design. They were an instrument in the hands of the Nazis to expedite the massacre and the extermination of the Jews. Of course, in the areas of the Soviet Union, which the German army had invaded, the Einsatzgruppen generally did not set up ghettos. They simply wiped out everyone they could. And that was to a large extent true in the Baltic republics. But wherever they did have these ghettos and they used them for labor, part of the German armaments industry and so on, they established Judenrat, and 2/3 of them were composed of Zionists. I mean,
and these groups actually helped select people for deportation or cooperated?
Yes, I mean, the Nazis would give them a figure of Jews they wanted for deportation, and they were the ones who did the selection. Not only the selection, but the rounding up, even when it was known where the destination of deportation was going at in Warsaw. So in Warsaw, the Judenrat and who sent the Jewish police into, because the Nazis generally didn't do the roundups. It was the Jewish police who did the roundups. And it wasn't simply grabbing anyone they could see. I mean, they conscientiously went about their tasks. So in Warsaw, I mean, they would dig up and expose well-hidden dugouts where people could survive. So they were absolutely thorough in this. And this was carried out, I say, by Jewish police, who were mainly Zionists, of course. In Warsaw, it was a revisionist. The revisionists tended to form the largest part of the Jewish police everywhere. But today, I mean, the Zionists are aghast, and they were at the time of Hannah Arendt when she brought out her book Eichmann in Jerusalem. She said, if there'd been no Jewish leadership, far more Jews would have survived. And this was met by mass outrage and horror. Gideon Hausner, the prosecutor at the Eichmann trial, laid into her and Raoul Hilberg, who he said were responsible for this cruel, unkind attitude to those who had betrayed the Jewish masses. But we only need to take our lead from the Jewish masses, who everywhere hated the Judenrat. I mean, the Zionists may love them, but the masses of the ghettos, which is where we should take our lead from, they absolutely hated them, Rinkowski and all the rest of them. But it's no surprise, because the Zionists provided, Isaiah Trunk did a survey of those who survived. 2/3 of them were Zionists. So, I mean, that's why, and some leading collaborators after the war became leaders again of their own Jewish communities. I mean, that was reality.
How about the Zionist leaders in Palestine? Did they make rescue of Jews their number one priority? I seem to be making you amused again. One would think that once they knew what was going on, they would shelve other activities and go 24/7 to try to help Jews in Europe.
Well, you might think so, but sadly, that isn't the case. Can I bring up this document? It's from Boaz Evren. It's a book which is, I quote in my own book, The Jewish People or the Jewish Holocaust or an Israeli Nation, I think it's called. And you'll see page 260, there's a long footnote, number 3. And this is about the Evian conference. For those who don't understand what Evian was, Evian, in 1938, Roosevelt called a conference concerning the Jewish refugee camp problem, which was held in the French spa town of Evian. And nations were invited, states were invited on the basis that they didn't actually have to change their existing policy. So it was a face-saving exercise. But the Zionists, nonetheless, were extremely worried about it. And Evian says, and you can see this in front of you, here is a quotation from a letter by George Landor, who was in charge of the settlement of German Jews for the Zionists, to Stephen Weiss, who was the leader of the American Zionists, dated February the 13th, 1938. The conference itself was held in July. And he said, I am writing this letter at the request of Dr. Weizmann, who became the first Israeli president and was a long-time leader of the Zionist organization, because we're extremely concerned lest the problem, this is the problem of refugees, be presented in a way which could prejudice the activity for Eretz Yisrael, that is Palestine. Even if the conference does not propose immediately after its opening other countries, but Eretz Yisrael as venues for Jewish emigration, it will certainly arouse a public response that could put the importance of Eretz Yisrael, that's Palestine, in the shade, Jewish Palestine, of course. We are particularly worried that it would move Jewish organizations to collect large sums of money for aid to Jewish refugees, and these collections could interfere with our collection efforts. Then there's another statement by Menachem Asishkin, who was a leading Russian Zionist, who knew Herzl, in the meeting of the Jewish Agency's executive on the 26th of June, 1938. So it's just before the conference starts. He says, he is highly concerned at the Evian conference. Mr. Greenbaum is right in stating that there is a danger that Jewish people also will take Eretz Yisrael off its agenda, and this should be viewed by us as a terrible danger. He hoped to hear in Evian that Eretz Yisrael remains the main venue for Jewish emigration. All other emigration countries do not interest him. The greatest danger is that attempts will be made to find other territories for Jewish emigration. And the account of Ben Gurion's statements at the same meeting, no rationalization, quote, can turn the conference from a harmful to a useful one. What can and should be done is to limit the damage as far as possible. He doesn't know whether the Evian conference will open the gates of other countries to Jewish immigration. But like Greenbaum, who later became chair of the Jewish Agency Rescue Committee, and Asishkin, he fears that at this time the conference is liable to cause immense harm to Eretz Yisrael and Zionism. It was summed up in the meeting that the Zionist thing to do is, quote, to belittle the conference as far as possible and to cause it to decide nothing. Well, of course, nothing did get decided. But you know, I mean, that was the Zionist attitude.
Terrible danger.
Yes,
just
I mean,
awful.
What can you say? Yeah, I mean, so when you ask, was it a priority? I mean, no, it was quite the contrary. It was the thing they feared most.
So that's 38. But what about when they actually know that there's extermination going on, or attempts at total extermination? I don't want you to laugh again. Did they change their tune in the 40s, in 42, 43, 44?
There is no evidence that they changed their tune. In Britain, the border deputies did their best to oppose all attempts, for instance, by Rabbi Moshe Schonfield, who was chair of the Chief Rabbi's Rescue Committee, to sabotage any attempt by him to get parliamentarians to agree, for example, that any refugees who came to these shores would be admitted, or they would be admitted to other parts of the British Empire. He vehemently did that. There's an exchange of correspondence, which is in my book, where they openly admit that only the border deputies had the right to represent British Jews. All other efforts were not kosher, treifa, if you like. And they opposed them. They sabotaged them. And of course, who suffered? It was those who died. There is no evidence of the Zionists, although there's a latter attempt to say they did. I mean, there's simply no evidence to suggest that their attitude changed at all whatsoever. On the contrary, the big conference they held in 1942 at Biltmore didn't even mention the refugee question. Their eyes were focused solely on the Jewish state. And you know, for many of them, the dead in the Holocaust was the price that they paid. And they said this to gain access to the negotiating table after the war. So they made absolutely no attempt at any stage until the very, very last stages of the war. And even then, they went for the Brandt agreement, or the Brand proposals, the million Jews for 10,000 trucks in Hungary, which was a deception, and it was a clear and obvious deception. But that was the
I want to go back a little, though, to talk about Hungary. I want to go back into Europe and talk about Hungary, because even though they had an anti-Semite running the place, the huge bulk of Jews had not been killed. And so you have this Zionist leader, Reszo Kasztner, and you talk about him and the suppression of the Auschwitz protocols.
Yeah.
What was that?
Well, Rudolf Verba and his friend Alfred Wexler escaped from Auschwitz. And of course, it was extremely difficult to escape from Auschwitz. And they did it with the help of the Auschwitz resistance. And I do recommend people read Verba's book, I Escaped Auschwitz. It's as good as any thriller, but it's true. And it keeps you on tenterhooks. They escaped on the 10th of April, 1944, and they reached Slovakia 2 weeks later, 23rd or 24th of April. And they met the Slovak Jewish Council, which was also a collaborationist council, but consisting of the local leaders who, I mean, they certainly didn't welcome the extermination, of course, because it was their own people as well who died in the deportation. Slovakia was the first country to deport its Jews. And they realized that, yes, the rumors were true and the Jews no longer were alive. And they sat down, Wetzler and Verba, to write in different rooms their accounts of what Auschwitz was. And then they were brought together, these accounts, and they realized from the separate accounts that what they described was true, that Auschwitz was the main extermination camp. And the Auschwitz protocols, strictly the Auschwitz-Verba report, because it was added to, was very detailed in terms of the layout of the gas chambers and the crematoria, and the process and the numbers, which are higher than anyone accepts now. But anyway, all of this was compiled into what became known as the Auschwitz protocols, and they were translated into German and various other languages. But at the end of April, we think the April the 29th, Kastner was visiting Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, and he was handed a copy. And yet, instead of getting it translated, it was in Hungarian, I think it was translated for him. Instead of getting it distributed, he suppressed it as part of his agreement with Eichmann. And his agreement was simple, that there would be a train out of Hungary for 600, it later expanded to 1,684 Jews. The elite, the Zionist leadership, some of the Orthodox Jews and so on, the bourgeois Jews who paid for the seats, in exchange for which they would keep silent about where the trains, the deportation trains, were heading. Not only that, but it would help again in the roundups. They would have local Jewish councils who would insist and order people to come to the collection points, because Hungary was not like the ghettos of Eastern Europe. Jews were not easily traceable. Most of them were assimilated. It would have been extremely hard in March 1944, when the Nazis only had a contingent, the Eichmann's Judenkommando had 200 people, including drivers and typists and so on, simply to round them up, the Jews. And of course, this was, if you like, towards the end of the war. The Russians were beating down. They'd already surrounded Romania. They would soon surround Hungary and Budapest. So, I mean, this wasn't something they could devote that much resources to. And so Kastner's organization, together with the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, basically operated as, again, an instrument of the Nazis. And in 3 months, nearly 500,000 Jews were sent to Auschwitz. And that was a direct result of the collaboration which enabled it.
And I've read some of the things about this where letters would be sent back supposedly from these wonderful villages in Hungary where the people who had been deported were set to work, and Kastner's people distributed these postcards, and it was all a total lie just to keep people quiet.
Yeah.
The thing about Kastner, though, that we should mention is that, you know, he's not just a one-off. He's not just an awful renegade. When he survives all this, gets to Israel, he becomes a part of the government. And when there's a court case about this, instead of holding up their hands in horror, the Labor Party defends him to the hilt. Could you talk about that a little?
That's right. Kastner was actually on the slate to be elected to the next Knesset from the Israeli Labour Party. If I take you back slightly, in 1953, an old Hungarian Jew allied to Mizrahi put out, as he was inclined to do, a scurrilous muckraking pamphlet, and the latest edition accused Kastner of being an outright collaborator. And the government insisted that Kastner sue him for libel so they could bury once and for all these allegations that the Israeli Labour Party was the prime, if you like, collaborator with the Nazis. And he was represented by Chaim Cohen, the Attorney General. Kastner was not terribly happy about this because I think he knew that his story would come unstuck. But anyway, the trial was set to start 1st of January 1954. And at first, I mean, the judge offered Greenwald the opportunity of pleading guilty and getting a lighter sentence for these terrible accusations, but he stuck to his guns. And slowly, with the aid of his lawyer, Shmuel Tamir, who later became a Likud MP, Democratic Movement for Change, who was a brilliant cross-examiner, he got to some of the truth. And the main thing, when he asked Kastner, is it true that but for your testimony, Kurt Becher, who was an SS colonel, who was Himmler's personal representative in Hungary, is it true that you obtained his release from Nuremberg? And Kastner indignantly denied it. And then Tamir produced out of his briefcase a piece of paper where Kastner had boasted of the fact that he'd secured his release. He was responsible not for the murder of Jews, Becher. He was responsible for stripping Hungary's Jews of their wealth, and he did that through extortion. So he operated in tandem with Eichmann. I mean, he was described by Yehuda Bohr as an opportunistic rather than an ideological Nazi. Well, I'm not sure that's true, but extortion was his main goal. He certainly saw service in the Pripyat marshes in Poland in the wake of the Eichsatz group, and where he was awarded 2 Iron Crosses. So he had a lot of blood on his hand anyway. But towards the latter part of the war, as he saw it was lost, as many Nazis did, he suddenly became a rescuer of Jews. And to Kastner, he was a savior. And so that's how he justified it. But as we know later on, Kastner also helped to rescue at Nuremberg people like Hermann Krüme, who was second in command to Eichmann, and who was in charge of the nuts and the bolts of the extermination in Hungary. An absolute mass murderer, not just there, but elsewhere in Europe, Salonika and so on. You know, Wyszynski was another he tried to obtain release for. He failed in that case, and he was hanged in Czechoslovakia. But these were the people, and Kastner did this. He went to Nuremberg to testify on behalf of these Nazis, not as an individual, but as a representative of the World Jewish Congress and the Jewish Agency. And they have never, ever disavowed what he said. They paid for his fares, or part of them, and his expenses. So Kastner was not a lone individual. He represented the Zionist movement, which had no interest in persecuting ex-Nazis if they could do deals with them. And Becher became very rich. He was involved in the supply of armaments and other stuff to Israel. So why would the Zionists go after him?
So instead of crushing this guy who had issued the pamphlet against Kastner, the judge says that Kastner sold his soul to the devil.
That's right, yes. In the middle of 1955, the trial had gone on for, I think, 9 months, and then the judge had taken quite some considerable time to weigh up the evidence. There'd been a host of witnesses, a lot of Hungarian Jewish survivors who'd been misinformed, misled deliberately, in particular in Kastner's hometown of Cluj, where they were told, get on the transports because the first people on will get the best places in the resettlement. And of course, we know where those trains went. There were no best places. The only place was in a gas chamber. So these people came back. Often their whole families had been wiped out bar themselves. You know, they were thirsting for blood. And they testified at Kastner's trial as to what had happened. They were deliberately misinformed. And Cluj, which had a large Jewish community, was 5 miles from the Romanian border. It would have been easy to escape. The border was open. Romania was a place of sanctuary now. It had been a place of mass murder, of course, previously. But now, I mean, Ionesco wanted to save Jews. He didn't want to kill them because his own neck was on the line. And so Romania became a place of safety. And probably 5,000 to 10,000 Jews did escape to Romania. But, you know, I mean, thousands more could, but the Zionists dissuaded them from doing so. Kastner said, oh, the dangers are terrible and great, you'll be caught. Well, even if you were caught, at least you tried. Whereas on a deportation train, there is no escape.
So the trial ends with this judgment or the statement from the judge against Kastner. The Labor Party does not throw up its hands and let it go. They appeal it.
They appeal it, and in the process, they bring down their own coalition government because the general Zionists basically withdraw. They can't accept that we can defend Jewish collaboration like that. And there was all sorts of, I mean, the Herut, the Communist Party, I mean, they were all attacking them. And so Kastner, first of all, it was in 1957, I think, he was assassinated by 2 or 3 ex-members of the Secret Service who were formerly aligned with Stern Gang. And there are files which to this day, and I detail some of the evidence, are kept secret. And you might ask, why are they kept secret? What national secrets are there that cannot be revealed? It would seem that Kastner was only winged when they assassinated or tried to assassinate him. He wasn't killed and he was recovering in hospital. So a second attempt was made, this time successfully. And there's an Israeli researcher who's been digging out medical records and so on as to his recovery. And the fact he's basically suffocated with a pillow. It's as simple as that. They could not allow him because of what the information he held to, if you like, testify at any future trials or tribunals. And so in his absence, the appeal was conducted in the wake of his death, and by 4-1, the Supreme Court overturned the verdict, although one of the four refused to exonerate Kastner because of the evidence, Judge Goyton. But this was on legal grounds. They didn't overturn the evidence. They accepted Kastner was a collaborator on the question of Kurt Becher because the evidence was there. You couldn't say he wasn't. But on legal grounds and on political grounds, they exonerated him and said, well, yes, he was right to choose to save the few out of the many. This is our Zionist tradition. And of course, they're right, yes. You know, you save the elite and let the masses die. I mean, that is the Zionist tradition.
Want to switch, but want to talk about Hungary still, but the most famous Holocaust survivor that we know about in the United States is Elie Wiesel, and he was in Hungary. And
well, there is another famous one, I think even more famous, George Soros.
Well, we could get into him maybe later, but I just wanted to, you know, he was a Zionist, and he was in the camps. He survived. But then when he read about what had happened, for instance, Tom Segev wrote the Seventh Million, and Elie Wiesel did a review, Wiesel very critical of Zionist leadership in Palestine.
Well, yes, I mean, no one was. There was no more ardent Zionist than Elie Wiesel. He would excuse anything Israel did in the name of the Holocaust, but even he could not stomach what had happened in Hungary. He said, how could it have happened? How is it that we were not informed? And he went on, I mean, we could have escaped. And he gives us the details of his own maid who came and said that she had a place prepared in the mountains for him. And his parents wouldn't let him go because, as far as they were aware, the trains went to a place of safety and resettlement only. And I give two examples, one of which was Wiesel, that there were, you know, thousands upon thousands of Hungary's Jews could have escaped because not all Hungarians were anti-Semites. There were many, many, especially Christians, who were prepared to put their necks on the line in some cases to save Jews. And we saw that in Budapest, where the Holocaust was halted. There was hardly a religious institution in the city that wasn't harboring Jews. At the meeting we had on UN Anti-Racism Day in Britain a few months ago, one of the speakers was a Holocaust survivor, Stephen Kapos, who was hidden in the children's home, again in the mountains surrounding Budapest. So I mean, there were, you know, in Budapest, maybe 200,000 out of the 250,000 Jews survived. But the Zionists, you know, I mean, I read in Kastner's report, Kastner was preparing in Budapest to draw up a list for a future train and reach another deal with Eichmann so that the Hungary's Jews would be deported, Budapest Jews would be deported, but they would have another list of the elite who would go by train out of Hungary. I mean, this was the depths to which the Zionists sank. And of course, none of this is today. You know, in Israel, the Kastner trial rocked the state, but you don't hear about the Kastner trial today.
Now, to be fair, there were Zionists in the U.S. who did fight for Jewish refugees. I'm talking about Peter Bergson and the famous screenwriter Ben Hecht.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I think Bergson and Shmuel Merlin later became non-Zionist as a result. I know Rennie Brenner interviewed them. I think they did draw some conclusions in the end, but I refer to a Jewish commission that was set up in the United States under, I think it was a ex-Supreme Court judge, Judge Goldberg, which was riven by controversy, and in the end they could not reach a conclusion because the draft report which Merlin had produced was unacceptable to the Jewish leadership. It's not surprising why that was so. Because yes, I mean the American Zionist leaders also helped the betrayal, especially as it's Stephen Weiss, who had a particularly ghastly record.
Yeah,
And all of this,
I remember reading about the Bergson and Heck having these meetings in Madison Square Garden. It was "They Shall Not Die," filling Madison Square Garden, talking about what was going on and pressuring the government, calling for 1,000 rabbis to go sit in front of, Congress or the White House.
White House it was, yes.
White House.
The rabbis marched, but the Zionists opposed that march and poured scorn on it in Congress Weekly, which is Weiss's own paper. The Zionists weren't prepared to do any campaigning during the war in respect to the refugees, and Weiss had access to Roosevelt, but he never raised these issues. On the contrary, when they had the opportunity, they attacked Bergson and Merlin, suggesting they should be deported as aliens for not having served in the American army.
Now, you raised this a little bit. I want to talk a little more about what I thought was surprising, even hopeful accounts of people who did help Jews during the Holocaust. I mean, growing up, I was pretty much taught that outside of a few shining cases, Europeans turned their backs or even collaborated in the killings of Jews. But your book mentions a lot of people who helped Jews. Could you mention a few?
Yeah, I mean, there were examples in virtually every country. I mean, some countries were not so good. The Baltic republics, where 90 to 95% of the Jews of Latvia and Lithuania died, there was extensive local collaboration, and I don't think we can overcome that. In particular, the militias, Martis, and so on, they, if anything, initiated the wiping out of Jews of Kaunas and Riga, in concert with the Nazis, of course, because the Nazis were always willing and wanted to portray the pogroms against the Jews and the massacres as being locally initiated, which is rarely the case. But yes, throughout Europe, there were extensive networks. In France, there was a French Jewish resistance, which obtained great assistance from Maquis, the French resistance. I mean, the meeting I mentioned with Stephen Kapos earlier this year, it also had a French Jewish survivor, child survivor, Susanna Weiss, who's written her own book on her own experiences, and she was sheltered in Auvergne, a department in France where 5,000 Jewish survivors were, because 3/4 of French Jewry survived the Holocaust. Probably 60% of Belgian Jewry survived the Holocaust, despite the best efforts of the Belgian Judenrat, for example. And the resistance executed the head of the Judenrat, Robert Holsinger, because of his efforts to comply with Nazi orders. So again, even in Poland, I mean, there were thousands of Poles who participated in saving Jews, although there were, of course, Poles who betrayed them. And tragically, you see, it took maybe 100 non-Jews to save one Jew, but it only took one informer to betray a Jew. And the same was in the Netherlands, which was a very difficult case where 3/4 of the Jews died. I mean, Anne Frank's own family were ensconced in a safe house, but they were betrayed by someone. We don't know who to this day. And so, I mean, that was true throughout Europe. But one of the remarkable and shining examples was in Nazi-occupied Europe was Albania, which is 2/3 Muslim. There, not one single Jew was deported. And it was the only country in Europe where the number of Jews increased, not decreased. Yet today, of course, under the Zionist influence, the Muslims are the enemy. You would think, really, that the Holocaust had occurred not in Europe, but in Arabia. They talk about the Judeo-Christian heritage, knowing full well what that heritage really was. I mean,
but before we leave this topic, though, I want to talk about the Catholic clergy. Because
yeah.
I found that particularly interesting because, there was this play, Rolf Hochlich, I can't pronounce his name, the deputy talking about Pius and how he was silent. And there's a whole bunch of argument about the very, very top. But you say a lot of priests helped Jews in Europe.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the record of Pius is not a good one. Let's be clear about that. He was first and foremost not an anti-Semite, but he was an anti-communist, and he wasn't prepared to attack or criticize the Nazis for their extermination because he feared Hitler's loss would also be the demise of the Catholic Church. He was a diplomat, of course, and a politician, really, not so much a religious leader, but the apostolic delegates, people like Bertzio in Slovakia and Martellotti, strained every sinew in order to try and prevent the murder of Jews. And I've mentioned Hungary, where virtually every Catholic religious institution, and also Protestant ones as well, saved Jews. In the Netherlands, the Catholic Church was better than the Protestant Church. It issued a declaration condemning the Nazi deportations when the Protestants gave way. Likewise in France, the French Catholic clergy, in many cases, were outstanding. So
we're talking about thousands of people saved. We're not talking about 1 or 5 or 100.
Absolutely, yes. It's difficult to put figures on it, but a figure of about 200,000 to 300,000 might not be unrealistic. In Slovakia, although Rabbi Weissmandl and the Judenrat there believed they bribed the Nazis to halt the deportations, and I think this is one of the major errors of Lenny Brenner's book, incidentally. It's very clear that the Catholic Church was responsible. It was what the judges in the Eichmann trial called a simulated concession. In other words, Wisłoceni allowed the Zionists and the Judenrat to think they had bribed him, but that wasn't the case. It was pressure from the Catholic Church on Tiso, who was a Catholic priest who was prime minister, and the other members of his government, which brought the deportations to a halt in September of 1941. So, but yeah, I'm not saying the Catholic Church was perfect. In Poland, large numbers of priests were anti-Semitic. Although in Poland, let us not forget, hundreds, thousands of Polish priests were themselves wiped out by the Nazis because they were a major target. So again, it's difficult to provide any realistic assessment, but the Catholic Church, for all its sins, has a far, far better record than the Zionist movement.
I just have a few more questions. When did you start writing this book? It's what, about a 400-page book?
It's over 500 pages with the index and illustrations. So yes, it is a big book. I started writing it really about 2012-13. Unfortunately, I fell ill with liver disease, with needing a transplant. So I was only able to work on it fitfully for much of the time. But yes, it's a decades-long work. And obviously a considerable amount of research has gone into it and so on. But
so it was published in 22, right?
Yes, in November. Well, I think the publication date is different, but it first appeared for public circulation in November of last year. Yes.
So what has been the book's reception among leftists, among scholars?
Well, you can read for yourself on the back. I mean, it's it's got praise from people like Ilan Pappy, Moshe Machava, Chaim Bereshit, Professor Richard Falk, who is the UN rapporteur for Palestine and a Jewish emeritus professor at Princeton, Ken Loach, and others. So the reception from, if you like, anti-Zionist and Palestinian supporting academics has been almost unanimous. I mean, there's been very little criticism. What's remarkable is, unlike, say, Lenny Brenner's book 40 years ago, which ran into a storm of protest and disputation, the Zionists haven't attacked the book. They simply haven't mentioned it. As far as they're concerned, it doesn't exist. I think they took a strategic decision. They didn't want to get into this debate because they know it's a debate they can't win. So, yes, I mean, I think they realized that if they started attacking it, it would actually just simply increase circulation and the number that are sold. So they decided.
But the academic historians have not reviewed it. I mean, I couldn't find any on the web.
No,
they don't want to touch it.
Academic historians choose safer topics. I mean, most of them are licensed historians by their own ruling classes. They rarely engage in topics which might cause too much controversy. I've spoken to the Socialist Historians group in Britain, and it had a good reception. And of course, amongst socialist historians, yes, I mean, those who have any anti-imperialist consciousness will be perfectly happy with it. But the wider historians community will take, I think, somewhat longer before they can get their act together. I'm sure the attacks will come eventually, but I don't think they wanted to spread the message too quickly. But by Palestine solidarity supporters and activists, it's been received very favorably. I've shipped about 2-3 book caseloads boxes to South Africa, for instance. I did a Zoom meeting with South Africa PSC. I've spoken in Germany, where again a large number of books have been shipped. So it is certainly getting circulation, and there is, I understand, a German edition which is going to be published at some point.
How does one get your book for here in the States? How would we get it?
Well, you might be able to get it from Amazon, or if you're squeamish about Amazon, you can write to me directly and I'll give you the instructions. It's just my name, Tony Greenstein, 104@gmail.com. But you better do it quickly because I may not be around for much longer. So I'm on. Well, I've been found guilty of taking part with Palestine Action in an attempt to redecorate one of the Elbit factories. So I may be facing a prison sentence, and obviously I can't send out any books until I come out of prison. But for the rest, yeah, I mean, that's fine. So try and get hold of me very quickly within the next 2-3 weeks if you want a book. I would if it's someone in the United States. Unfortunately, I'll have to charge about £20 in postage costs, but you'll get a signed copy.
Now, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk at least briefly about the legal jeopardy you're in. So you were convicted. What was the exact charge you were convicted of?
Oh, the charge is intent to cause criminal damage. We never got there because the police intercepted us, but trying to cause criminal damage to a factory that produces weapons with which to kill civilians and engage in war crimes, in the eyes of the British judiciary, is itself an offence. And that is what the issue is. So I was convicted along with 4 others, and I will be sentenced on June the 26th. I really don't know what the sentence will be, so I can't predict whether I will be available after then, and if so, when.
Well, thank you very much.
Palestine Action has been very successful in what they call decommissioning Elbit factories. 2 so far premises have been decommissioned. So there is a strong campaign that continues on, but obviously some people are becoming casualties of that campaign.
And the group of people who were planning to do something there, what is the name of the cause? I mean,
the group is Palestine Action, it's called.
And if people wanted to find more on that,
it's on the website. We've got a website. So the latest action is to lay a siege to the Elbit factory in Leicester. They've had massive support from the local community, many of whom are Muslims, and the police have been very, very heavy-handed because we are seeing increasing police repression in Britain. But they've laid siege to the factory, the Elbit factory in Leicester, and that's an example. So if you just go to www.palestineaction.org, and there you will find it.
Well, thank you so much for this interview, and good luck to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Stanley, for the interview, and I hope to see you around. Okay, take care, everyone.